What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that focuses on leadership. I'm Jonathan White, and in each episode I'm joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the Home Secretary. I promise we'll behave, Ms. Patel. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make Britain work. We discuss everything from the opposition's plans to slap the oil industry with a windfall tax to the local politics in Halifax, and of course the innovation and success in the country that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the current political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by Matt Fleming-Duffy, Director of Cherry Mortgage and Finance Limited. Matt has worked in the financial service industry for more than 25 years and specialises in first-time buyers, home mover, remortgaging, expat mortgages, green mortgages, and of course Help to Buy. Cherry was founded itself in 2012 in Bournemouth, and with Matt we'll be discussing how Cherry operates, the challenges facing the sector, and what policymakers should be doing as we look to the future. Quite a lot to get through. Matt, welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Now, it's been a few months since, obviously, Cherry Mortgage and Finance has been in the review. I think perhaps it might be a nice place to start. The listeners would be keen to know what you and the team have been up to since.
Yeah, trooping on as usual, I think is the honest and simple response. We're a small firm. We're a small financial intermediary. We're a mortgage broker. We specialise in, I guess, more unusual cases. A lot of that is down to sort of my sort of personal experience and knowledge of the market. But yeah, we're a small firm that's been able to sort of adapt to changes in the market, and a lot has changed. Particularly over the last sort of few years.
Absolutely.
With rules and regulations and things like that. But yeah,
and I think I think you obviously keep playing on with, but I'm sure they keep you very busy. And it's interesting though you bring up though, Matt, that you're a small firm because you'll have a very different approach and behave differently than perhaps more larger firms, certainly. What have been the unique challenges you faced as a consequence of that? But conversely, what strengths does a small team bring to the table?
Yeah, it's a simple one to answer, really. I mean, being really practical, the mortgage market in the UK is very evolved and it's very diverse. There's over 150 mortgage lenders in the UK. There are quite literally thousands of different sort of mortgage products, but the sort of big six high street banks still sort of dominate the mortgage market. They're responsible for something, certainly over 2/3. I think it's close to sort of 3/4 of the sort of mortgage markets. So, what they say almost defines, or what the sort of business areas they operate in almost sort of define the market.
Yes.
Now, it's very hard. Like you say, as a sort of small firm, it's very hard for us to advertise or sell our services, if you like, when you're competing with the likes of the big banks who can advertise on bus stops, on the TV, in the newspapers, things like that. So, kind of getting our message out there and getting our services out there. And like I say, really sort of, talking about the fact that there's more than just these kind of handful of lenders that kind of dominate the headlines. That to me is the sort of biggest challenge, because people come to me sort of saying, I'm beside myself. I've spoken with my bank. They can't help. I don't think you can, but here's my situation. And I can sometimes respond, no problem. There's a dozen lenders that can help, So that's a challenge. The kind of, trying to sort of, compete in that respect is very difficult. But equally, as a small firm, we can move very quickly. We can move with market trends. We're very dynamic as a kind of small firm. And look, I know how this sounds, but there's not much I don't know about mortgage lending. I've been around the market for a very, very long time. I know where to turn, for sort of, most scenarios. And like I say, it's that sort of message that, like I say, is very difficult to kind of advertise and promote if you're a small firm. But, I'm not just talking about the banks, because obviously we're competing as well with your brokers with deep pockets that have had significant funding. Habito being a very obvious one to talk about, where they've got a TV advert, crikey, well done them. And great actually in lots of ways for sort of championing the kind of cause of an intermediary, because, TV adverts tend to be the kind of realm of the big banks. So in one respect, it's a positive sign to see a broker with, a funding behind them advertising the kind of the services, but equally their model is different to quite a few others. So again, it's a blessing and a curse all at once.
Absolutely. And with the domination of the larger lenders, I mean, it's in the old days we'd have happily and easily called that a monopoly. It will be interesting to see how that market does develop, especially with smaller firms offering increasingly competitive and interesting products. And as you've said, you've been in the business, I'm sure the listeners, you won't mind me telling the listeners, a good 25 years or so. But of course, Jerry's been going now for, I think, 7 years, if that's right.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, how would you say the market has changed in that time? And especially, if I may ask, in relation to regulation, especially from Europe?
Yeah.
A bit of a big question, that I know.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, look, if I just talk about my experiences and obviously in coming into the market in the early 1990s, I've seen a lot of change. I worked for Abbey National, as they were back then. Now, obviously owned by Santander, or the bank Santander. When I sort of started, working in financial services, regulations were there. You had a whole batch of different regulators for different parts of the market. You had Loutra and FINBRA and the SIB and, then the PIA, which morphed into the FSA. And of course, we now have the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA. The regulations have changed, and look, I don't want to sort of finger too much the kind of issues that we saw in the early 2000s, because look, my background is working as a financial advisor and mortgage underwriter. When I worked for Abbey National, you had an underwriting mandate. You assessed the case, you asked questions because you're talking to somebody, you're talking to a consumer. You were not just advising them on the right product selection, but you were asking them questions. Are you going to move? When do you seek to retire? There's a lot around the kind of the assessment of a case. So when you signed the case off, you were underwriting it. You had to write an A4 sheet of paper to summarize the case. Obviously, the world of computing, has started to dominate, mortgage lending practices, and it has done for quite a long time. When that sort of technology really started getting a hold, I think banks, would put their hands up to say they were quite guilty of running with technology when it wasn't necessarily fit for purpose and seeking to kind of streamline processes. They had, full support from the regulator at the time, which again would put its own hands up to say the regulations were too soft. It was quite a sort of a hands-off regulatory approach. Back in the 2000s, credit crunch came along. There's lots been written about that, over the last sort of few years. Great book by Vince Cable that sort of, pointed at, the kind of operations of certain banks that caused the problem. Great movie, I think, The Big Short, which again sort of points at what the actual problem was. People still don't have a great understanding of that mechanism, if you like, of securitization and sort of trading in mortgage bonds, and still sort of point the finger of blame at poor underwriting practices at places like Northern Rock, of course, which got caught in a sort of crossfire. Regulations that then came in sort of post credit crunch were long overdue. There's no question about that. The UK regulator, the Financial Product Authority, of course, ran a mortgage market review and set some very sort of direct and strict regulatory challenges to banks and building societies. Set some really sort of strong guidelines, rules.
Stringent, yes.
We've had that. Yeah, absolutely. We've also seen more recently the Prudential Regulation Authority, PRA, which of course is a division of the Bank of England, sort of wade into buy-to-let and sort of say, not issuing rules, I hasten to say, but sort of issuing guidance that most lenders have followed to the letter. So you've got lots of sort of regulations that kind of surround these transactions. It was almost a sort of pendulum that, in my opinion, sort of swung too far. It does seem to have softened, I think, to a certain extent, that the kind of the message that's come out of the regulator is that we're not big fans of interest-only mortgages, particularly if you're approaching retirement. But of course, you now see retirement interest-only mortgages that have been approved by the regulator. So they're kind of softening the stance to say, well, there are reasons where it's practical. And again, it all just comes down to that assessment, should we or shouldn't we be doing certain things? Now, one thing I'm going to touch on is something that you did ask me about specifically, which of course is EU regulations. Right. Because what's gone on, very separately across the European Union, it's something that we've been party to, and we've had a sort of hand at sort of forming the EU Mortgage Credit Directive, which of course came into force in 2016, March 2016. You have to kind of look at the EU as a whole to understand why those sets of regulations came in. They weren't, as the MMR was, they weren't a direct reaction to the credit crunch necessarily. What the EU was trying to do, to give it sort of credit, was to set common standards across the European Union. Because if you as a consumer were seeking to buy a property in, I'm not going to pick on any country, but if you went to Spain, I don't know, and went to any country and said, I want to apply for a mortgage, the application process would be very, very different. If you compared it to the UK or any other sort of EU member state, you may not get an illustration. You may not get a mortgage offer, a formal mortgage offer. You may get a very, shortly typed, A4 piece of paper that says this is your mortgage offer. You didn't necessarily have much in terms of consumer protection.
Almost practically sometimes zero.
Yeah, well, it was intensely variable, and of course, the EU, as in a broader context, what it's trying to do is to set common standards across, the European Union. You can kind of give a thumbs up to that and say, well done. It's a valid exercise. But of course, with the mortgage market in the UK being far more evolved than any other mortgage market in Europe and possibly in the world. I mean, maybe the US, certainly they've got a very dynamic market. So, no specifics of that. But certainly in terms of the mortgage lending practices that we've got here, the market is very, very evolved. So all we really saw in the sort of context of the Mortgage Credit Directive was a change in the way you see a mortgage illustration. So we had a key facts illustration, a KFI, which has sort of been replaced really by a European standard information sheet, and ESIS, which is, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same. But of course, for other EU member states where they didn't have anything, they now have the kind of the systems, the processes, the protocol for the delivery of sort of mortgage contracts. There's a couple of things, of course, that in this Mortgage Credit Directive that have been really problematic. In particular, the biggest sort of problem point, I think, is the buy-to-let market, which doesn't exist anywhere in the EU except for here in the UK. Suffice to say, if you've lived in Germany and you wanted to buy a property as an investment, the mortgage assessment, if you like, the mortgage affordability assessment is based on your personal income, not, as it would be in the UK, the rental income that the property generates. So you start with this kind of absolutely unique sort of market proposition that we've got here with buy-to-let mortgages. You can then sort of fall into this consumer buy-to-let categorization, which is where you haven't bought a property for the sole purposes of renting it out. It might be some property you've inherited or formerly occupied. That falls under this kind of consumer buy-to-let definition, which is part of the Mortgage Credit Directive. So very confusing set of regulations, which in principle seem very sound and easy to follow, but in practice, just causes lots of lots of hurdles and lots of problems. Now, I go to lots of seminars. The mortgage industry very, very frequently. Pro-Brexit individuals will sort of put their hand up and say, when we leave the EU, how quickly are we going to row back from the Mortgage Credit Directive? So it's certainly a sort of contentious issue because, like I say, the UK very evolved market. Mortgage market review came into effect in 2014. So MCD was almost a set of regulations that we don't really need. We've been party to the sort of formation of those rules, but it would be interesting to see what happens.
It certainly will do. I think the points are exceptionally valid when it comes to the British market. It's a different animal compared to most of it. I think Germany. I think barely half of properties are privately owned. Of course, they're huge renting market.
That's right,
and it's extraordinary. And you have to applaud the effort of creating a single credit market, really. But this one-size-fits-all approach, when you have a sort of awkward Britain there, it does make things quite difficult. Yep. And I say when, perhaps it should be if we leave, who knows anymore, the European Union, there was really going to have to be quite a robust conversation in this country with the regulators about what exactly we want to do with the legislation we'll then be able to control. Certainly a conversation, I think, for perhaps next year, Matt. But looking at the British market, again, more specifically, and it is so different from the rest of Europe. I think in the last quarter century, house prices have, gone up by close to 500% by now, 450%, something like that. Needless to say, wages have not followed. The shortage of housing in this country is a hot political issue. From your point of view, Matt, what are the short-term and medium-term solutions to where we find ourselves at the moment?
Yeah, it's like you say, it's a very, very hot topic. Some people are very much against the buy-to-let market, so they're saying that kind of artificially inflates the value of a property. As a landlord, would be buying properties that would be generally suited to first-time buyers and small families. That's the buy-to-let market. But I would sort of say as a quick point on that single issue that most landlords in the UK only have one or two properties. Yes. I saw some NatWest research recently. It's 60-70% of landlords only have one or two properties. So they see this is a way of sort of supplementing their income in retirement, or as an alternative to saving into a pension. It's a positive thing. So
people do have this impression, I think, that all landlords are some sort of perhaps Peter Rackman character. It's and I think when you're quite right. You're quite right to bring up the stats because yes, you're absolutely right. It is often just the one or two.
Yes. Yeah, so I think that has to be sort of noted because you then sort of go on to the kind of the answer to your question, and the kind of short term and long term solutions really are a bit more complex. However, I've seen a pledge for the Tories today to offer lifetime fixed rates. That in itself is quite standard, of course, in lifetime mortgages, in equity release type mortgages. It's also quite standard in the US with a mortgage. You take you take a mortgage at a rate that's fixed at the point you take the mortgage, and it's fixed for the term of the mortgage. So I think that, longer term fixed rates are a really sort of positive thing. And I think then as as an industry, we can seek to look beyond the kind of the next year or two of somebody's projected income and think longer term about how much can they afford, how much can they borrow, and this kind of discussion around affordability calculations is something that I can't summarise properly in the space of a kind of a 20-minute conversation, but it needs to be a lot more detailed than it is at the moment, but not in the way that things are being assessed at the moment. It's very binary. It's very binary for most lenders. And again, talk about the kind of the big six. They're working these sort of models of high volume, low administration, quick underwriting, computerized decisioning, sort of things like that. Now, that's great. It does serve a purpose, but there's a lot of rigidity around how much somebody can borrow and what a lender feels is affordable. And you get down to sort of pounds, shillings, and pence with these things sometimes, and the kind of conversations that you can have, with a bank around what somebody feels is affordable and what the bank thinks is affordable, I just, can be poles apart sometimes. And I just think that needs addressing. So the ability to be a bit more flexible in our thinking as underwriters, as assessors of mortgage transactions. And to be able to provide access to slightly increased borrowing amounts on the basis that you can fix your payments for a much longer period of time without these kind of huge early repayment penalties, to withdraw from mortgage, I think would be a positive thing. Now, at the same time, I've really got to sort of bring into this sort of conversation property prices and how. Yes. If you start then allowing more borrowing capability, all that tends to happen in an unregulated property market is, property values start drifting up. How much can you get for my house? How much, we've just sold that one for 200. We can now sell yours for 210. I've seen that the Ministry of Housing has mooted the idea of regulating the estate agents. I think that's a really, really good idea, and it's long overdue. The sort of history to an estate agent, of course, is that they were all, generally speaking, they were all surveyors. Yes. They morphed into to sell properties, and you've ended up now in a sort of situation where you have somebody that can kind of pop up, have a pop up shop day one, and day two start selling and marketing properties. That needs addressing.
I think you wouldn't go to a dentist without qualifications, and I think people need to start looking at this market in exactly the same way. And there are models. 100%. I think speaking of New Zealand, which has a similar a developed mortgage market, not a dissimilar one from Britain. Indeed, has these standards set centrally.
Yeah, there's quite a few countries that have a regulatory regime for property agents, for estate agents. To have a sort of a licensing regime, where a license can be revoked for poor practice, to ensure that agents, go through basic training and have an exam, have some kind of qualification that says they understand the process. And really sort of having closer links to RICS, I think, having closer links to the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. And there's 100 mechanisms I've got sort of spinning around my head about how these sort of things would work in practice. But I think all of that would help to maintain sustainable growth in the property market and to help sort of prevent, property valuation spikes, which of course we've seen historically, certainly in my career. And, you just end up in this kind of boom and bust, cycle. And it's just, I don't want to use there's an overused phrase, isn't it? It's not sustainable. It's just not. It needs addressing. Like I say, we can go back to the kind of mortgages and how much can you afford to borrow. Well, if you start looking at rent as part of the sort of factor in how you assess affordability, there have been some really great sort of technological advancements where you've got firms that can register your rental payments in a centralised database, and that's going to be fed into your credit report, into your Equifax and Experian credit reports. So if you look then at the kind of the amount of income, the amount of affordability you can evidence based on your income and the rent that you're paying, you find there's a great difference between what a mortgage lender says is an affordable monthly payment compared to what you're going to be forced to pay in terms of monthly rent. And of course, the argument is, well, the mortgage payment can jump up when we expect rates to rise.
Yes.
So if you go back to this point that the Tories pledged to say, well, okay, let's have long-term fixed rates then. So you can then sort of surely factor in the rent comparison. So if you're paying a rent of £1,500 a month, let's say, that, and you're paying it, and you've been paying it for a year or 2 years or whatever, and then you start looking at the sort of mortgage affordability assessment, and the figure you come up with shows a mortgage payment of $850 as being a maximum mortgage payment. That's quite realistic and quite common disparity that I see in looking at first-time buyers in particular. But to say, well, your affordability calculation, Dear Bank, your affordability calculation seems out of touch. To say the client can only afford $850 a month when they're paying £1,500 a month in rent. Let a broader conversation about how we increase that limit you're saying as $850. Now, how are you then approach that as a regulator is one side of the conversation. How you then sort of approach that as a mortgage lender to mitigate risk with overextending mortgages, which of course historically we've seen in drastic measures with the self-cert lending, is really something that comes into that sort of broader context of discussion that we have to start having. Because, as it stands, people are being priced out of the market. Absolutely. They can't afford to buy. So all you hear about in the press is this, these ogre landlords that are causing problems. We need to hack at them. We need to tax them. We need to, destroy the market. We shouldn't even be there. I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong to look at things in that way.
If since we've already started to talk about it, actually, Matt, we might as well dive into it. We speak, just so the listeners know, the day the Labour manifesto has come out, which I think it's fair to say, and having leafed through it, it's not the kindest on the buy-to-let market or many other markets, actually. But we do speak before the Tory manifesto coming out. Now, as you've already mentioned, Matt, there are two policies, it seems, that have already leaked regarding the market: lifetime fixed-rate mortgages, 5% deposits.
Yep.
Let's maybe a quick thought experiment, shall we, Matt? You're in CCHQ right now. You have a fresh piece of paper in front of you. What would you want to see as a business owner, as a consumer, in that manifesto when it comes out on Sunday?
In what context? Sorry.
Certainly regarding the market.
The housing market?
Yeah, yes.
I mean,
I'll limit you to two things.
Yeah. This is going to sound, very, very partisan. I really, really, truly believe that this kind of commitment to build is a positive, and a commitment, a kind of suggestion of creating a market for long-term fixed rates that don't penalise people for leaving, these mortgages, too early. I think those two things are absolutely huge. They're massively complex things to tackle. They're not kind of simplified. I will just spend more money on things. It's a real case of trying to work with markets to help them evolve and adapt. So, propping up kind of house building. Has got to be a sort of a big thing. it's a very tricky issue to resolve.
Oh, quite.
I went to a seminar a few years ago where one of these sort of think tanks was there, sort of saying the only real solution to the inverted commas housing crisis is land grab. For the government to kind of step in, and start, repossessing, large areas that would sort of lend themselves to development. But I think that any government that actively pursued that kind of land grab, would be absolutely trounced at the next election. It's a real tricky one because we all agree there's a problem. We all agree that, loosely speaking, if you make housing more available to more people, that it would solve a lot of the problem.
Yes.
But nobody's happy if it's going to be on their
no, it's when NIMBYs and comes into its own, isn't it?
NIMBYs, 100%, yeah. And I've actually listened to a speech by one of the sort of senior surveyors at the Nationwide Building Society, who said that in his opinion we don't have a housing crisis, we just have too many empty homes. So kind of getting the empty homes out into the market and to kind of seek to repossess those, and make them available would actually solve the housing crisis very quickly. At the same time, I used to sit on now a disbanded group with the Bournemouth Housing Forum, and Bournemouth Council, which is now Bournemouth Crisis Support Council,
yes.
So said that they actually tried this. They started looking at the issues with some empty properties, and how would they possess and repossess them and get them sort of sold into the market or force a sale into the market. And this wonderful lady explained that the real difficulty in, number one, identifying who owns a property, finding the conditions of, how they have that ownership, and then to start communicating with them about possessing their property. So if you start from that end, that's extremely litigious. So you have to really make sure that your lawmakers are, fully on board with that process of possessing private property. You then have to kind of backtrack to say, well, what kind of scenarios and how aggressive are we going to be when it comes to that sort of repossession? Because, she explained or described a particular case to me, where there was this very large property actually in Bournemouth, quite near the centre, which of course would lend itself to development or to selling to somebody that wanted to move in as a family home. And it was empty, and it'd be empty for a while. And it was a husband and wife that had lived in the property. The husband had sadly passed away. The lady of the house had then moved into long-term care. She was no longer fit, so her children were sort of left with under sort of power of attorney in managing the property, but the siblings had fallen out, so they couldn't agree on what needed to be done, and it just got locked. That's one case out of God knows how many,
yes,
where it was very difficult for the council to find out who owns the property or who is responsible for the property. And then when they did, they were writing to two different people who couldn't agree on what needed to be done, to help their mum and what would be done with the property. So it's a really, really tricky problem, because building on Greenbelt, when I grew up at school, that was just an absolute no-no. You will never build on any green,
Yes.
Yeah, completely, brownfield sites were industrial. And of course, in recent years, brownfield is actually old industrial, ripe for development as housing, and some greenfield is up for grabs. And you think, crikey, that's a huge shift. So building on fields and building adjacent to towns that have got infrastructure. We've got Poundbury, of course, which is coming of age now. In Dorchester, the area. I mean, that's really coming of age. Really fantastic development. There's a great website called Create Streets, which sort of talks about the kind of build, sort of process in the UK, and how we should be focusing on building, building streets, properties, with Victorian style or Georgian, style sort of buildings, rather than these kind of high-rise blocks. And look, if you go to Poundbury, you see a great example of that. But all around the UK, there aren't these obvious areas that lend themselves to that kind of development. So what you end up with, like you say, is the kind of the NIMBY response that you've got a small village and a great big field next to it where everybody walks their dogs, and there's the local football team that play on a Sunday. That gets earmarked, and you have local protesting. So it's a really tricky problem, because, like I say, any government that pushes it too hard, is just going to end up with all governments get bad press, whatever they do, but they'll get more than their fair share of negative press commentary, I'm sure.
And perhaps even trickier for the Conservatives, given that many of their younger voters that vote for them are people that very much aspire to own a house, only for their older voters are very much the ones that live next to the Greenbelt. So it is a bit of a catch-22 there, but we wait with bated breath to see the manifestos, which will obviously also, by the way, be some of the more environmentally friendly manifestos I think we'll have seen in our lifetimes. We're all environmentalists now, and I know that you're doing your bit at Cherry with your green mortgage proposition, if that's right.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Now, a lot of people would be very unfamiliar with that concept. Do explain a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I sort of coined a phrase actually that there's lots of eco warriors out there, and I like to think in some ways that I'm more of an eco ninja with this because I've got in my opinion anyway, a sort of quite a balanced approach to the way that we can move towards a less carbon led economy, and I think there's ways and means, and obviously talking about things like Extinction Rebellion, I agree with the message. I don't agree with their methods, So green mortgages to me is something that we've been working on for a while now. I guess that the first thing to say really is that there is no actual definition of a green mortgage. It's something that we've coined a phrase. We're sort of picking up on the kind of the thoughts and feelings and emotions of people that we speak with. And actually, I was asked the question by somebody a few years ago. Do you do green mortgages? And I sort of went, "What's that?"
Yes.
So we said we created it. There are, I guess I should caveat that by saying there are, two lenders in the UK, that do offer, what they regard as sort of green mortgages. You have Barclays, which would allow you, which will give you a sort of a tiny discount off of their standard products if you buy an energy efficient home from one of their selected builders. There's also the Ecology Building Society, who can help you to you borrow money to make your home more energy efficient. Now, the ecology model kind of falls into line with the energy efficient mortgages action plan. I think EMAP, I've got in my head, which is the European initiative. In the UK, we've got the Green Home Finance Innovation Fund, which is our kind of equivalent to that, in that we're, the government sort of trying to incentivise UK banks and building societies to produce products that provide funding for people to make their homes more energy efficient. The EMAP, as I understand it, the European initiative, really hasn't had much take up at all from the banks that have sort of said, yes, we'll consider it. And the Green Home Finance Innovation Fund, sadly, as I see it, is doomed to failure. The government's offering up £5 million to one or two corporate entities that they have to match in terms of funding to conduct market research to launch a product that's loosely going to be in line with what the ecology already offer. I remain unconvinced about this as a strategy. However, what we're doing as a small firm is that I talk about green mortgages to people that are interested in anything that is environmentally friendly in terms of completing home improvements to their property. Now that can range from energy efficiency to converting properties that were uninhabitable into new properties that can be occupied, but other things as well. To sort of go beyond that, to start looking at things like composting toilets, Powerwall for your electric car, anything really. This is conceptual at the moment. I have tried to gain some traction by talking to government departments, to various lenders around this, and unfortunately, it's falling on deaf ears. There's not much in terms of traction with the general public around products that are more expensive to offer these sort of things. So it really remains for these big banks to sort of step up. But essentially, the sort of vision that I've got is that in the same way that the Help to Buy has become a central hub of information, as it stands today, I think we could have a kind of a green hub, if you like, a green mortgage hub, where people that own property, or even tenants, can sort of go to this centralized hub to find, local advisors, local contractors that are themselves, environmentally aware, and that can help, somebody to, make their home more sort of energy efficient.
And given the direction of travel we're going in, I'd be quite surprised if a product like this is not something that in a few years' time we're talking about in much more the mainstream. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, look, we're a tiny voice in this. We're a small firm. We are. We've placed to plant one tree for every mortgage that we complete, and we are offsetting 1 ton of CO2 for every mortgage that we complete.
Superb.
We're running that through. A sort of Amazon project, and the trees are being planted in, using schools in the UK. We're a small firm doing this. If all mortgage lenders did this, wow, what a change to the environment. What an impact we have in a positive way in the environment. From that sort of change. And these things, to me, are soft changes that are so obvious. The Help to Buy initiative. Was great. The market was it stagnated. Builders weren't going to build homes because they couldn't be guaranteed that people could buy them at the back end. Osborne came up at the time of the scheme. The Help to Buy, scheme where the government will give you 20%. Towards the purchase of a new property, interest free and then very low interest. Great scheme. Builders suddenly feel, empowered, confident that they can sell their properties at the back end, of the build. That Help to Buy really stimulated things for the market. It was so successful, but of course, lots of people said, I don't want to buy a new home. I want to go and buy a second-hand home, but I can't get a 95% mortgage. So in came the government with Help to Buy too. Great scheme. Again, it sort of kick-started the economy, kick-started mortgage lending. Fantastic, positive outcome. And actually, Help to Buy captured the imagination of the press. Most people talk about Help to Buy as a positive thing. Consumers understand it. It's simple. And under this Help to Buy banner, now, locally, if you go and find your regional Help to Buy advisors, you'll find in there how to buy, where you might have your ability to buy your council property under the Right to Buy scheme. You'll see details of all the shared ownership schemes. So, like I say, it's become a regionalised, hub of information. And I think that the very same thing could be achieved with green mortgages, with making green improvements, to environmentally aware improvements to your life and your property, not just energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is a big thing, but we've got to talk about the sort of broader context here of what we're sort of trying to achieve. So I think that kind of network, the Help to Buy, simple but very effective kind of methodology, could be translated into a green a green mortgage network. I don't really know. It needs some playing around with marketing people, to come up with that. But that kind of concept that, look, if you want to do things that are good for the environment and you want to do it locally, where do you go to find an installer that you can trust? Where do you go to find the sort of funding. Where do you go as a centralised place for this? There are, some initiatives, that are out there currently, but kind of centralising it all, putting it into the hands of the consumer, I think is a positive thing.
And it's a pretty exciting future on that front. And who knows what promises we'll get in the manifestos, the Tory manifesto. You never know. Now, we must. I'm conscious of the time here, Matt. We must bring things to a close. But before we do, I noticed that we should congratulate ourselves. We got through this entire recording without talking about Brexit. So let's ruin that. I'd like to know the opinion. People are, however you voted, Remain or Leave 3.5 years ago now. There have been, no matter what sector you're working in, no matter where you're investing or not, as the point is, it has caused so much uncertainty in every market. Have you found, in Bournemouth, that to be the case? Have you found people just holding on, waiting, dithering as a consequence?
Yes. So, quite simply, yes. Not dramatically.
Yeah.
But certainly we had a very poor month in October compared to other months in the year, and obviously Brexit was about to happen, so people pressed pause. I think that, like you say, that the biggest thing with this is just uncertainty. If you're going to move and borrow more, or you're going to move in, to the house of your dreams, or if you're going to refinance to put a conservatory on, or buying your first house, whatever your situation is, you are going to be uncertain. I mean, we live in times of uncertainty. It's kind of part of the course, isn't it? And if you look at Brexit, this is such a contentious issue.
Oh gosh, yes.
It's absolutely polarising opinion, and I'm firmly on the fence about Brexit, because
I've never met one of them before.
Oh no, I know it's so tricky. The economic case for remaining in the EU is relatively simple, but we just got to ask ourselves as a nation: do we want to, become or remain an EU member state, which is what we're talking about here, or do we want to really define ourselves as dear old bad old blighty? The EU's definitely been guilty of mission creep over the last few years, and it needs reform. The thing with Brexit, of course, that it pulled lots of people out of the woodwork. Do you think we should just leave and turn our backs and forget it? And say let's move away. And of course, the immediate aftermath of the Brexit was that you had a movement in Italy, movements in France, Spain, all these countries that have started jumping up, saying, "Well, we want to leave. We want to leave. We don't like this at all." And that with all the kind of the hard-nosed politics that's gone on, the kind of the terrible rhetoric that's come out of EU leaders, in particular, anti-British rhetoric, these countries have stifled that kind of noise, and a lot of those kind of movements are kind of I don't think they're being suppressed. I think they're sort of backing off a bit and saying, well, we just need to have a bit more reform. We need to reform the EU. I personally don't know. I really can see the case for remaining, because I don't like change, and there will be negative consequences for the UK. There's no question about that economically. At the same time, I firmly believe that the UK is something quite special. Great Britain is great. The Commonwealth has got 50 member states. If we leave and trade on WTO terms, well, there's over 150 members of WTO, and they account for most world trade. So I don't have that extreme anxiety about leaving that some people seem to profess. I mean, in some ways, it seems that some people are so anxious about the future that they see remain part of the EU as sort of staying on a path to enlightenment. And I don't think I really subscribe to that point of view. You've got to look at the kind of problems with it.
And what I don't remember, and maybe this is a new thing, but when we were members, well, we still are, I suppose, but when we were before the referendum, I don't remember anybody in the country, apart from very, very, very few federalists perhaps, having this love for the European Union. Even those that were in favour of it did it quite begrudgingly sometimes. Whereas now we do have sort of evangelists for both sides.
Yeah, yes, it's religious. It's almost religious. You know, it's odd. It's really odd the way that it is so polarising. That people are so impassioned either way.
Well, absolutely right. Well, I think I've got to say, because time's caught up with us here, but we can talk about this for hours. I know we could, but we probably shouldn't. We'll make sure, Matt, it's been a pleasure having you on here, and I hope that
Thank you.
after the election, and perhaps even, dare I say it, after we leave the European Union, we can discuss this in a little bit more detail.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed our chat with Matt, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at Cherry Mortgage and Finance are continuing to raise standards. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is our conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, Eric Pickles. Lord Pickles served as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in David Cameron's cabinet before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the United Kingdom's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as being a keen vexillologist. That's flags to you and me. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed speaking to Eric. Here it is now. Eric, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. Given your experience over those years, what thoughts have you had over the last few weeks and months about the current political situation the country finds itself in?
Situation is quite dire because we have a parliament that is by and large useless. It's like a bored teenager on a long drive, and it knows what it doesn't want, and it's so bored with Brexit, but it can't agree. So no matter what you put up, it's against it. Are you in favour of a referendum? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of remaining within the single market? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of... No, I don't want to do that. No. And are you in favour of leaving without a deal? No, we don't want to do that. So it's against everything, but there isn't enough votes to be in favour of something. And it could be by the time this podcast goes out that Boris has started on the process of the bill, because we'll be voting on that today. But even then, what people don't seem to understand, this is not the end of Brexit.
Right.
This is barely opening the door of Brexit. We've got years of negotiations about trade agreements, relationships with Europe, putting down pieces of legislation. We get our agriculture, our fisheries, our financial services into place. Brexit is going to go on and on and on and on. I'm sure we are.
Now, the question is, I should actually remind listeners that we are talking on the day that the second reading of the European Control Act will take place. So, as we speak, we don't quite know. As, well, perhaps like the government front bench, don't know what's going to happen. You compare Parliament to a petulant teenager. What do you do to a petulant teenager to sort it out? Is there a chance that it will see sense and push this through this bill without making amendments? Is there a chance it will vote for its own for a general election? How do you see this playing out at the moment?
The sensible thing will be to put this deal through, because I've always been of the view a deal is better than no deal, because this is just the beginning. In order to start the process of Brexit, start the process of the United Kingdom taking over powers that it's not really exercised for 40-odd years, the smart thing is to get this thing through now. But in a way, it's not about Brexit itself. If there was a free vote, this deal would have gone through. Mrs May's deal would have gone through. But it's about politics. It's about a Labour Party that thinks it has a chance, trying to make the Prime Minister, whether it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson, look as though that they are in office but not in power, of delaying as long as possible. There's a lot of talk about an election in the autumn, maybe back end of November, beginning of December, something for us to look forward to before Christmas. It's beginning to look less likely. It's beginning to look as though they might want to drag it into spring to get as far away as possible from the rather decisive moment that Boris came back with a deal. We have to remind ourselves that nobody thought he could deliver a deal, and it does quite shock them. And if you remember, all this process went through in order to ensure that we were left without a deal. When we have a deal, suddenly, oh no, it's not that kind of deal. We don't want that kind of deal. We want something different.
I think the vast majority of people in this country, whether Remain or Leave, now would be very satisfied for this to come to a amiable conclusion. And as you correctly just said, because when it does come to those in the opposition who claim to want this to end, and then introduce wrecking amendments, they introduce new objections to it, the general public are getting quite frustrated.
But you've got to understand that quite a lot of people don't get beyond a small area within Westminster, sometimes cliche referred to as the Westminster bubble, and go back to their own patch. Now, by and large, everybody hates their MP, except when they're at home, doing the fairs, wandering around, helping people. So they, in a way, they're cosseted to that great, which I feel is coming as a tsunami of change.
You were, of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you resident there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshirean, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your old constituents right now? You hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament because you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want, and I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership. Well, I
was used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you'll know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
No, I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay for to be members, and it's a way of not being beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, you're echoing the words, of course, your fellow Chairman Lord Blunkett has said. What some might not know is that you started your political journey, perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Oh, absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
Oh, so I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it then that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. And I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I'll join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around, and my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to it. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed, but I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story. Most people might guess that a dynamo Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office. But who is it that you have?
I'd Che Guevara. I always had him over my left shoulder of visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, I can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Bunk was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives would never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, for something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realised that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road at Cardinal Place, a fantastically new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was the proudest moment, do you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state, and it was on the basis of tough love. It was on the basis of getting people into jobs. It was about dealing with the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress that since, of course, you're stepped down to being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continues the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had include some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet. This is something like that goes in the state to repress it. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old maids cycling to evensong and Warburn. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
And I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many members, many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption-free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all passed out. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit of stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
I think it very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let listeners know what projects you are working on with that and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country? Well,
I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. but more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you reference as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, so many years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, and particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. The hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. It's something I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine you were actually very content and happy. The former Prime Minister, friend and colleague David Cameron just released his book, and you came quite unscathed from it.
I came out. He was very nice about it. I even bought the audio version because he was reading it, and he obviously, but there was a fair bit of affection, and I'm rather glad they left out one or two of the other embarrassing things.
Maybe another time.
Yeah.
But it's important, I think, and I'm conscious of the time. But I think it's important that today people have become so perhaps caught up in what's happening in this country regarding Brexit. Looking to the future, what would you say that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to?
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years and it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle, those that have been left behind by our economic progress, and it will be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know that's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Lord Pickles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to the Morpeth Arms to raise a glass to raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.